Newsmakers and market movers. This is The Pulse with Francine Lacqua.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Having already called Volodymyr Zelenskiy a dictator, President Trump is escalating his public war of words with the Ukrainian leader as he pressures Kyiv to accept a deal with Russia.
I love Ukraine, but Zelensky has done a terrible job. His country is shattered, and millions of people have unnecessarily died. And you can't bring a war to an end if you don't talk to both sides. You got to talk. They haven't been talking for 3 years. So we hope to see a ceasefire soon and to reestablish stability in Europe and the Middle East.
Well, let's bring in Bloomberg's EMEA news director, Ross Matheson. Ross, when you look at the war of words, I mean, this is a huge policy shift, actually putting Russia before the European allies. Where does this go next?
I was just saying it's pretty stark because we had the former president, Joe Biden. I mean, he was calling Vladimir Putin a dictator, and now we have the US talking to Russia and the current US president calling the Ukrainian leader a dictator. So it's just a complete shift in tone and really at this point quite a fundamental breakdown in the relationship between the US and Ukraine, and really driven in a way by Donald Trump's dislike of Volodymyr Zelenskiy, which goes back quite some way. It's become very personal. So the question is, how in all of that do you have, a measured negotiation and conversation, and how do you involve Ukraine in that? I mean, US officials are still saying, yes, Ukraine will be part of the conversation of getting a deal towards a ceasefire, but it's very clear that they're laying some of those parameters first with Russia in a way to present something to Ukraine and say, this is the deal that we think can work. And so the ability of Ukraine to negotiate here and Europe to be part of that conversation is very much diminishing. You can see that in a way in the sort of growing panic amongst European leaders about how they can get in the door on the conversation. And we have now the leaders of France, the UK, planning to go to DC next week to try and talk to Donald Trump about that. But really, what does it mean? It means the wiggle room from Ukraine here is very much diminishing, and it's diminishing quickly.
Ross, I mean, Donald Trump was also talking about a new China deal. We're very thin on details. What do we know about that?
Well, it did seem to be a bit of a throwaway remark that he made last night about the potential for a trade deal with China. Of course, China is the one country the US has now enacted tariffs on, and China has retaliated. There's a long history of trade tensions between the countries. That said, there does seem to be a personal rapport between Donald Trump and President Xi Jinping. He has warm words for Xi Jinping. He's been a bit of a light touch on China so far, even though they've imposed tariffs, and certainly sees room to do business with China. He's talking about the relationship with China in the parameters of a broader global reset. So you have, a US, Russia, China nexus, essentially, and China being a big part of that. I mean, there's no sign of any talks happening at the moment on trade, but it does show again that Trump's quite willing to do deals with China if needed.
But, Roz, what do you make of all of this? Is this like a shift in policy that he's now, friendlier with Russia and he's friendlier with China, or is it that he wants a deal at all costs?
Well, it certainly seems to be in what we're seeing under the prior administration as accepted norms about who you deal with and what your relationships are. All of that goes out the window. So none of what you would presume to be behaviour should continue, which is why, again, you see Donald Trump talking about working with Russia and China to lower their stockpiles of nuclear weapons, to all cut defence spending. And so he's engaging with what are US allies in different and new and confronting ways. He's engaging with what have been US adversaries in new and different ways. And that's all part of this complex soup of a very fast-shifting global power balance that's moving in all kinds of different ways. And again, it's like, how do places like Europe and allies like Australia and Canada and others keep up in all of that?
Ross, thank you so much. As always, Bloomberg's EMEA News Director Ross Matheson with, of course, some great analysis, but also the right questions. Now let's look at the market reaction with Nataliia Lipikhina, head of EMEA Equity Strategy at JPMorgan Private Bank. Nataliia, as always, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, it does feel, you remain optimistic about equity markets, but they've kind of been all over the place in the last 3 days as they look for a deal, they look at tariffs, and they look at what's happening with Ukraine.
We are the fundamental investors. So for us, what matters is earnings. And what is really interesting is we're just coming off the earnings season, and earnings so far have been actually very strong in both Europe and in the US. For example, in the US, the earnings is coming at 17% year-on-year growth, which is much higher than what the market was expecting. The market was expecting around 11%. Yeah. And then if you look into Europe, European growth is actually much lower than that, but still there are loads of beats from different sectors.
Where do you find value at this point, given in the US there's so much good news or encouraging news priced in that a lot of the stocks could be once again priced to perfection?
We do like 4 different sectors right now: industrials, utilities, financials and tech. And technology actually still looks quite interesting, especially the software part of that. We think that AI just will become everyone's life in the future, and software companies actually benefit from this. With the computing costs coming down, the adoption of AI will just grow. And in fact, many software companies are talking about adopting more and more AI offering going forward. So we're quite optimistic on that part of the market, and it's a global theme, not just the US but also Europe.
I was going to say, how much of these software companies can you find in Europe? We've always had an issue in Europe about scalability. Does it need to be bigger is better?
Not necessarily. I think it's more about integrating the right product to what the companies are offering.
When you look at some of the positive outlook in the technology sector, there's so much concern about growth in Europe. How do you match the two? Are there any sectors that you want to stay away from in Europe?
I think in terms of staying away, we don't like particular parts, for example, of consumer staples. But overall, I would say we're quite selective in terms of what we like in Europe in general. So, for example, one of the sectors that we remain quite positive, and I think I speak about every time I come to the show, is industrials.
Yes.
And we saw very strong numbers today also. What is interesting is data centers is a very big part of the industrial sectors, and we think that it will probably be the theme over the next year.
What's incredible is that they've done so well so far. So does it plateau at some point, or can you still pile in?
It's a very good question, because if you look into what US tech companies have said to us this earnings season, is that they continue to spend on AI in 2025. There is a massive ramp-up in the AI spending. And we think that, the data center companies in the industrial sector will just continue to benefit from this in 2025, as much as they did in 2024.
Nataliia, going forward, do you see a little bit more pressure on earnings per share? Maybe the margins getting squeezed given all of the uncertainty?
Well, we think that in the US in particular, we expect 10% growth in 2025 and then 10% growth in 2026. These numbers are quite staggering, especially if you think that the long-term growth is around 7%. So we actually think that earnings will drive the market this year.
When you look around the world, how does Europe sit, for example, next to Asia and the US? If we have a deal with China, does Europe benefit, or is it the periphery of China that could do better than expected?
Well, I would say that tariffs in general still continues to be an overhang on the markets, and that's why we're quite selective in terms of what we like in Europe. So we still need to understand how that will unfold going forward, because so far we don't have all the details that we need to know.
Nataliia, what do you do with gold? So gold, is at a record again. It's a hedge against many things. Does it make sense, if not getting out of equities, certainly having either a portion in cash or a portion in gold?
Absolutely. And this has actually been a topic for us this year. We continue to be quite positive on gold. We still see upside here. And in general, our outlook was calling for portfolio resilience, and gold plays a very important part in that theme.
I imagine a lot of clients look at also inflation prospects and worry that it's just moving too fast. What's the best piece of advice you give them?
Yeah, it's interesting, because this is actually one of the risks that we saw with the outlook this year, that inflation can just be a bit stickier than what the market was expecting. So for us, is adding uncorrelated assets to the public equities and bonds is something that we recommend clients to do. So think about infrastructure, something that is not correlated with public assets and can provide you really good protection when inflation may be a bit stickier.
We had a quite worrying for the Bank of England inflation number from the UK yesterday. Do you make a big difference between the UK and the rest of Europe?
Yeah, I would say that in the UK, the issue is we need to understand what growth picture it looks like, because the inflation can be a bit sticky, and this is what we see right now. But at the same time, all eyes on growth, whether the growth can actually pick up or not. And I think this is what, the BOE will have to understand. On one side, the growth prospects. On the other side is maybe potentially a bit sticky inflation.
Okay, Nataliia, thank you so much. Nataliia Lipikhina, their head of EMEA equity strategy at JPMorgan Private Bank, stays with us. And of course, a little bit later, the interview of the day, the interview of the week. You don't want to miss this one. The U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent will speak to Bloomberg Surveillance. That's at midday London time. Coming up, don't miss our interview with the Prime Minister of Iceland on geopolitics, defense, and the potential impact of U.S. tariffs on the country's aluminium sector. That's next. And this is Bloomberg. Iceland was one of the countries that took part in a second meeting this week on the future of Ukraine, hosted by the French President Emmanuel Macron. Now, the Prime Minister of the North Atlantic island was also at the Munich Security Conference last week as the U.S. administration took a dramatic policy shift on Russia. Now, the Trump administration has also announced plans to introduce 25% tariffs on all U.S. imports of steel and aluminium, a potential threat to Iceland's large aluminium industry. Well, the Icelandic Prime Minister Kristrun Frostadottir joins us now. Prime Minister, thank you so much for giving us a little bit of your very busy schedule. Prime Minister, when you look at the different stance that Donald Trump has on Ukraine today, what does it mean for allies like Europe? Is there scope for Europe to come together and have more of a say than we've seen so far?
Yes, I do think so. And I feel like in the past few days, honestly, I was in Munich last weekend, and I feel like in the past few days, we've seen a big shift in Europe stepping up. Europe is coming closer together. And sometimes at these times of, crisis, if you could call it that, and people find a way to come together. I want to reiterate, though, and say that this doesn't mean that Europe is going against the U.S. Europe is coming together to be a stronger ally for the U.S., and that's what's really important for Iceland as well.
But, Prime Minister, how would you describe the relationship that Donald Trump has at the moment with Vladimir Putin? It seems that he's putting Russia before his European allies. Would that be a fair assessment of the situation?
Listen, I think the most important thing now is that we focus on Ukraine and how we get to a point where we get a peace deal and a ceasefire that is on the terms of Ukraine. And obviously, Europeans need to be involved, and that's why Europe is following what's going on in these relations between Russia and the U.S. right now. We have been very strict and firm on our point, which is that Russia started this war, Europe stands with Ukraine, and Iceland stands with Ukraine as well. So the terms of a potential ceasefire, of a potential peace agreement is what matters. Ukraine at the table, Europe at the table is what matters.
When will we see that happening? Again, there's a lot of talk or concerns that the EU also doesn't have a great or direct relationship with Donald Trump. Would the EU back elections in Ukraine if that were to keep the President Trump happy?
We're not at a point where we're discussing this. I think everyone is aware that the situation is fragile in Ukraine right now. Elections would change the dynamics in the fighting and in the war as we speak. So we think it's mostly important now that we get Ukraine to the table and we have a discussion. The focus of the elections has not been what has been taking place in discussions between European leaders at this point.
Prime Minister, Iceland has 3 large aluminium smelters. What do you think of Trump's announcement that he will levy 25% tariffs on the imports of aluminium?
We're obviously concerned in general that we will see an escalation of any type of trade war, whether it be tariffs that come from the U.S. towards Europe or from Europe to the U.S. We have always had a good relationship with the United States. We've had very well-functioning trade agreements. We have a bilateral defense agreement, and we need to be able to do business with the U.S., but also with Europe. Historically, we have focused on making sure that we don't get stuck between these trade wars, because, as you say, we have heavy exports of aluminum. And this is why I've been having good talks with my colleagues in Europe, especially last weekend when I was in Munich, when it comes to the focus of making sure, if there is a trade war, that Iceland does not get stuck between. And we haven't seen any specific signs that U.S. is targeting Iceland, and we will just have to continue these talks.
But, Prime Minister, how worried are you about 25% tariffs? What kind of impact do they have on the economy, given, as you say, that Iceland is quite reliant on the U.S. market?
It would have an impact on us, and this is why it's important to keep the dialogue open. Like I said, we don't see any signs that we are being specifically targeted, but obviously we are worried about escalation on this effect. So this would be a grave concern for us. I mean, like with any nation, but especially a small open economy like Iceland, free trade is vital to our functioning. So this is something that I'm concerned about. But like I said, it's nothing sure that we'll be in this position, and that's why we have to keep the dialogue open in the next few days and weeks.
Prime Minister, your cabinet has promised a referendum on resuming negotiations with the EU no later than 2027. What are the benefits of re-entering these negotiations?
I think the main benefit is we need to get closure on this topic. So we went through this process about a decade ago when my party was last time in government. We made the mistake, I want to say, of not asking the nation beforehand whether they wanted to start these talks, because this is a big process. It takes up a big part of your bureaucracy, your system, and there needs to be full support behind going through this process. So what we want to do now is we want a referendum on restarting the agreements, then we get an agreement, and then we would also have a referendum towards the end of it. So we need to close this discussion, I feel. We are at a good time to have it. We still want to focus on getting a couple of years of breathing room, so to speak, that we get 2 years of debates, discussion. The government also gets room to get its domestic agenda through, because I don't want the main message from my government to be the only thing that can lead to progress in Iceland is to join the European Union. However, we obviously see a lot of positives associated with that, and have obviously a very good story to tell when it comes to our European Economic Area Agreement, which has lifted a lot of boats here in Iceland.
Prime Minister, let me also ask you about defense spending. Iceland is the only NATO member with no standing army. We know that President Trump has been calling for NATO members to pay more. Do you anticipate pressure from the U.S. to increase your defense spending?
We have a different type of agreement with NATO than other countries. I mean, we are a founding member of NATO. We have a very strong position within NATO. We have Keflavik Air Base. We are obviously geographically really importantly situated when it comes to the Arctic and other matters. We have responsibilities when it comes to air policing, when it comes to submarine trafficking and control. And we have nuclear submarines from the U.S. running through our waters to see what Russia is doing here. So we have a strong position when it comes to NATO. But we do feel the pressure, and it doesn't just come from our allies. We're just aware of our responsibility in today's world, that we need to be a part of an alliance. We need to be a good ally, and that means that we need to move towards our defense spending. And before this situation escalated, I want to say last week, when it comes to Ukraine and this push for a quick peace talk and a quick ceasefire, we had already gone through these discussions within my government that we needed to review our defense policy. So this is something that we're going to have to go through over the next, I would say, couple of weeks, couple of months. This is a very relevant topic here in Iceland.
But, Prime Minister, would you be open to the U.S. reopening the Keflavik Air Base in Iceland? Have there been any such talks?
We've had a ramped up infrastructure investments here in Iceland when it comes to Keflavik Air Base. We still have a lot of Americans coming here, working, helping us. We also have NATO allies coming that are doing air policing here in the region. So we are in contact with all our allies. There's nothing in the plans of having a long-term what can I say, physical presence of the U.S. military here. But we are open to continued infrastructure spending, to ramp-ups of military spending within our NATO alliance. And this is just something that we have to look towards.
But, Prime Minister, overall, I mean, these big trade wars between big countries, of course, have a disproportionate impact on a country such as yourself with 400,000 people. How can Iceland best shield itself from everything that's going on?
Iceland can best shield itself by having an open dialogue. We need to be in discussions, in open discussions with our allies, with our with the countries that we do most trade with. This is why my foreign minister and myself have been in open dialogue, both over phone and directly on the ground in Europe, having discussions through our embassies around the world. This is critical to Iceland's economy that we keep trade flowing. And obviously, like I said, I mean, what's most important is if we see an escalation of trade wars between the two continents, which we are sort of in between, that Iceland gets exempt from those positions. So, I mean, the simple answer is diplomatic ties and diplomatic discussions. And this is what we have been historically good at, and we will continue to do.
Prime Minister, just a final question on some of the volcanic eruptions, because I think there's been a number of them that have increased. I think you've had 10 since 2021, since, near the capital city, which means air disruption as well. How has this changed Iceland?
So we might see another eruption. It could happen today. It could happen next week. It could happen next month. We see a buildup of lava underground, so we could see another eruption. However, we have really strong policies in place now to protect the region, and have gone through infrastructure spending in the area surrounding the volcanic eruption where it's historically taken place, to make sure that we're shielding the most important roads, we're shielding the airport. And so obviously what type of eruption it is, which can differ. If it goes into the ocean, it will cause more disruption to the air and air pollution when it comes to aviation. If it goes over the main roads, that's going to be a block for that part of the peninsula. We've made plans for all these types of events coming up. So we feel pretty secure and okay with having these emergency measures in place.
Prime Minister, thank you so much for your time today. That is, of course, the Prime Minister of Iceland, Kristrún Frostadottir, joining us today. Coming up, our exclusive conversation with the Greek Prime Minister as Europe ramps up efforts to respond to President Trump. That interview is up next, and this is Bloomberg. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, and these are your top stories. Donald Trump turns on Volodymyr Zelenskiy, calling the Ukrainian leader a dictator and warning him to move fast to reach a deal with Russia to end the war. The U.S. president also says a fresh trade deal with China is possible as he touts his great relationship with Xi Jinping. Plus, Mercedes warns of a sharp drop in earnings as Germany's auto troubles continue, while Renault targets stable returns in a tougher European car market. So Greece has been involved in another round of talks convened by the French President Emmanuel Macron on how to best respond to the U.S.-Russia dialogue on Ukraine. The country is amongst the highest defense spenders as a percentage of GDP in NATO, a topic which President Trump often uses to criticize what he says is a lack of investment by the military alliance. Well, the Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis joins us now for an exclusive conversation from Athens. Prime Minister, thank you so much for joining us. President Trump has called President Zelenskiy a dictator. What's your reaction when you hear that?
Well, Francine, thanks for having me. President Trump is a very smart man, and, he has his own unique way of expressing himself. But I think that, in principle, I think we need to agree on certain fundamentals. And I'm sure that these statements that I will make are also also reflect the view of our American friends, that we need, peace through strength, that obviously there can be no solution for Ukraine without the Ukrainian Ukrainians being involved. And of course, there can be no security arrangement for Europe without the Europeans also being involved. So I think we're at a relatively delicate state when it comes to these discussions. And of course, Europe also needs to come up and emerge with a unified voice. And we need also to do what is expected from us in order to commit to our own security, not just Ukraine's security.
But, Prime Minister, what can Europe do concretely? So can they move without the U.S., or is it talking with the U.S.? What are the steps that you see going forward?
Well, Francine, I've always been, a strong advocate of Europe doing more to take control of its own security priorities. As you know, and as you pointed out, Greece is a country that is spending more than 3% of our GDP on defense, and we have been consistently exceeding the 2% threshold at times when richer European countries were not contributing to our common sort of defense budget in the way that they should. So, I mean, this is really the time when we need to move from words to actions. We need to spend more on defense. We need more fiscal flexibility when it comes to the European rules to allow us to spend more on defense without breaching European expenditure rules. This is something which has been acknowledged by the President of the Commission. I've been lobbying very hard to get to that point. And of course, I think we also need some sort of joint European borrowing facility that will allow us to implement projects of European common interests, such as a European missile shield, which would benefit the entire continent. Again, we've been talking a lot about these priorities over the past years, and I think now we're faced with what I would call sort of a rude awakening in a sense, and we need to move from words to action. So when President Trump many years ago pointed out that we didn't spend enough on defense, he was in principle right, and we need to make sure that we make up for the lost ground.
But, Prime Minister, in terms of timeline, when will Europe accept the need for joint bonds? Again, are those conversations accelerating at pace? Will it become a reality soon?
What I expect will become a reality as soon as the next European Council is the first sort of intervention which I talked about. We need more fiscal flexibility. So when we spend more on defense, the incremental spending should not count towards our European deficit calculations. This is a decision that we could make theoretically as early as the European Council in March. And frankly, we cannot delay this decision any longer, because should we choose to spend more, and again, I do need to point out that Greece has been spending significantly more than our European allies, we need the necessary fiscal flexibility in order to be able to do that. So I could expect a decision regarding the fiscal flexibility, what we call the exemption from the general sort of the activation of the general escape clause, to come as early as March. I think talking to many of my European colleagues who could be classified as frugals, they also recognize that in extraordinary times we need to take extraordinary measures. So the discussion about some sort of joint European borrowing facility is certainly on the table, and I also expect it to pick up steam very quickly.
I mean, I think Bloomberg Economics estimates that around $3.1 trillion over the next 10 years. Can Europe find that money, come up with that money?
I don't think that the money can come up exclusively from national budgets. So as I told you, we need a combination of national financing and European financing. We know that we have significant capability shortcomings in air defense, in military transport. These are gaps that we need to fill. But again, I do want to be very, very clear. This change cannot take place from one moment to the next. Hence, in spite of whatever tension may have arisen, I remain a strong proponent of the value of the transatlantic partnership. And yes, sometimes American friends may express themselves in a different way, but when they sort of point the finger at us and tell us you need to do more for your own security, again, in principle, they are right. I've been making the same argument for quite some time now.
Prime Minister, who will speak for the Europeans if Europe actually gets a seat at the table with Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin?
That is a decision we still have to make. One of the topics that we could discuss is to appoint a very high-level sort of EU representative who could speak on behalf of the European Union. Because right now we, as you know, we have the President of the European Council, you have the President of the Commission, you have the High Representative, but we may choose to actually appoint, a special sort of representative who needs to be someone with a lot of authority and gravitas who could represent the European Union. And I think it is necessary to speak with one voice.
I mean, it does seem that Vladimir Putin managed to achieve what they wanted, which is speaking to the U.S. directly, superpower to superpower. What can the EU now do to get a seat at the table for Brussels, but also Kyiv?
Well, first of all, when we talk about security arrangements in Europe, obviously Europe will have to be involved. One of the discussions that are taking place is related to future security guarantees to Ukraine. I think many expect that Europe will have a role to play when it comes to defining these security guarantees. That's why I spoke about the need to discuss the new European security architecture, obviously with the involvement of Europe. But again, the more committed, Francine, we are to addressing chronic shortcomings of the European Union, the more credibility we will have in playing an active role in these negotiations. That's why I do expect, and I'm calling for very concrete results, which should be reflected in the conclusions of the next European Council. We don't have a minute to waste.
Prime Minister, Donald Trump also announced new tariffs on auto imports as soon as April. Is the EU considering, or should it consider, to actually lower its own tariff rate to avoid some of the American duties?
As you know, this is an exclusive competence. Tariffs and trade is an exclusive competence of the European Commission. We don't want to get into a trade war with the United States, but should it be necessary, of course, Europe is going to respond. I think we still have time to avoid that. I think it would be bad for both our economies, both the European economy and the American economy. And I've always been advocating that if there are unilateral gestures that Europe can make to level the playing field, it should proceed with doing so sooner rather than later. But again, we should have no doubt that in case Europe is put in a position where tariffs are imposed unilaterally on European goods, Europe will be forced to respond. But I'm cautiously optimistic that we will be able to avoid this scenario.
I mean, does it have to adhere to WTO rules, or do you think Europe should try and get a unilateral deal with the U.S. directly?
Well, to be honest, I think this is going to be a discussion that will take place between Europe and the U.S. Directly, and I think we all see the value of making sure that we have a level playing field. And again, if there are unilateral gestures that Europe can make to level the playing field in goods where maybe we have sort of higher tariffs than our American friends right now, we should have the courage to do so.
Prime Minister, I also want to ask you something domestically about the Santorini earthquakes that, of course, are decreasing in number, but the outlook is quite uncertain. What kind of impact would that have on the tourism season?
Well, I noticed you had the Prime Minister of Iceland before me on the show, so he seems to be quite concerned with countries that are geologically active. Yes, we've had a lot of sort of medium-sized earthquake activity taking place on Santorini. We've seen a reduction of the activity over the past days, which is encouraging. Of course, we always listen to the scientists, and we have to prepare for all eventualities. But Greece is a safe country, and this is a message I wanted to communicate. No one can predict the future, but we're cautiously optimistic about what is happening in Santorini, and if things go hopefully according to plan, we'll return to a sort of a normal state relatively soon.
Prime Minister, thank you so much for giving us a bit of your busy schedule today. That was, of course, Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis. Now, coming up, we're also live in Berlin with the latest from the German election campaign. A lot of the focus will be on Donald Trump and, of course, on Vladimir Putin. This is after Scholz and Merz clashed in their final debate last night. That's coming up next, and this is Bloomberg. In Germany, the conservative frontrunner Friedrich Merz told the Chancellor Olaf Scholz that he'll need a miracle to win the election on Sunday. Well, Merz used the final head-to-head TV debate with Scholz to ask voters to grant him a strong mandate for a policy shift in Europe's largest economy.
Wir müssen in den nächsten 4 Jahren.
We have to solve two major problems in this country over the next 4 years. That is migration and it is the economy. And if we don't solve these two problems, then you and we and all democratic parties in the political center will not be facing a mere change of government in the 2029 federal elections, but rather we will slide into right-wing populism for good.
Zu vermeiden. Und deswegen ist die Antwort sehr klar.
I am convinced that this time there will be something that has rarely happened to this extent in previous elections, namely that some people will go into the election, into the polling booth, and only then decide who and which party to vote for. And I believe that in the end, many people will vote for the SPD and give me a new mandate to lead the next government.
Well, for more, let's bring in Bloomberg's Oliver Crook, who's in Berlin. Ali, this is a huge election. Of course, the election could decide the fate of Europe and even of the UK. What stood out to you from this debate?
Yeah, so listen, Francine, I think I sort of agree with Olaf Scholz's sort of appraisal of the election and this what he had to say, or actually one part of it, which is basically I think a lot of people going into this election, going into the voting booth on Sunday, are a bit undecided as who to vote for. I'm not sure I agree with his second point, which is that it's definitely going to be the SPD, but this is part of the setup going into this election, where the polls have really not shifted at all over the last few months, where Friedrich Merz is expected to sort of command a majority. There is going to be a question about what this coalition looks like going forward. We've had a very sort of savage, by German election standards, campaign trail where these two candidates really attack themselves very hard. But if the SPD does end up with something like 50%, Olaf Scholz's party, that'll be their worst result basically ever in history, and that may mean he will have to step aside. So that may be able to pave a way to have a more sort of productive working relationship between the CDU and the SPD.
So we've just had Mercedes earnings this morning. What does it tell us about the state of the auto sector in Germany?
Yeah, it doesn't say anything terribly good about the state of the auto sector. I'll just give you some of the sort of top lines here, where revenue was down almost 5%, 4.5%. EBIT was down 30% in the full year. Net profit was down 30%. Earnings per share down 25%. Listen, some of these factors were actually beats on what the anticipations were. So Mercedes did beat on the return on sales. On the margin, came in at 8.1% versus 7.4%. But really the big news we got out of the earnings was this cost-cutting proposal that basically Mercedes-Benz is now joining a lot of the other German automakers in cutting costs, trying to get 10% down costs across the board. Remember, Volkswagen has been in these huge negotiations with their unions, cutting jobs. That now seems to have arrived at Mercedes-Benz. We should also say that their outlook for the year, they're looking at return on sales, that margin, that key margin for Mercedes-Benz, between 6 and 8%. That is not really very comfortable for Mercedes. They like to get those margins in the double digits. But again, the other thing that we're looking at in terms of the outlook is, can Mercedes-Benz really give an outlook of any kind when you have Donald Trump talking potentially about 25% tariffs on the German auto industry as early as April? I think we'll have to reappraise all of these outlooks from these car companies to depend on what the Trump administration does come April.
Ollie, thanks so much. Oliver Crook there in Berlin. We're just also hearing from Mercedes saying there are no plans to shut down plants in Germany, but they do plan to reduce the global production capacity for cars. Now, we'll bring you all of the news, analysis and market moves as we continue to build up to the German elections this week, including a special program when polls close this Sunday. We'll all be live from Berlin. Now, as U.S.-Russia talks decide the future of Ukraine, South Africa is also hosting the continent's first G20 Foreign Ministers Summit. However, Secretary of State Marco Rubio will not be in Johannesburg, citing an agenda that includes, as he puts it, climate change and DEI. Well, for more, let's go to Soweto and Bloomberg's Jennifer Zabazaja. Jen, what can we expect from the G20 agenda over the next couple of days?
Yeah, Fran, I mean, the exclusion, at least, of the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and also Scott Bessent next week at the finance ministers meeting is a bit of a blow for this convening. We should remember that the G20 is a convening of the most advanced economies with emerging economies. And so it was and it is an opportunity for South Africa to bring a lot of the issues of the African continent and the global South to the table with a lot of these bigger economies. But it might look a little bit different without the inclusion version of them. But still, we've heard from officials saying that the priority is to discuss and debate a lot of the geopolitical issues that we're seeing right now on the global stage and see how the G20 can potentially come together and help solve those. But if you take a look at over the past few years, we've seen a lot of erosion in terms of cohesion with a lot of these members. And so the question will be, where can they find common ground, especially when you look at some of the divisions that we're seeing now. You were mentioning what we did hear from Secretary of State Marco Rubio about so-called climate change and DEI. We've heard President Ramaphosa, who will be here in just a few hours to open up these official meetings, say that he wants to bring the topics of debt relief to the table. Also, climate finance has been very important for him and for others in the global south, and talking about reforms of multilateral institutions. And so potentially we see the start of some of these discussions happening over the next 2 days with the foreign ministers. Next week, we'll see them take a different step with the finance ministers. But without the inclusion of Marco Rubio and also Scott Bessent, you can only imagine that we'll see other big major players like China and Russia and even the EU stepping in to fill some of those gaps. But still, I should note, we do have U.S. representatives that are planning to come here.
Jen, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Africa correspondent Jennifer Zabazaja there in Soweto. Now, Africa's rocky relationship with the U.S. under President Trump is the theme of the next episode of our monthly show, Next Africa. That's on Friday, February 28th. Now, coming up, the French car maker Renault is forecasting roughly stable returns this year. We discuss the outlook in Europe's auto industry next. This is Bloomberg.
This Sunday, Germany heads to the polls following the collapse of Chancellor Scholz's coalition. With the focus on the economy, migration, and geopolitical tensions, how will the German balance of power shift? Bloomberg Television has continuing coverage leading up to the election and will bring you the results after the votes are tallied with a special post-election broadcast. Tune in Sunday, starting at 5 p.m. London time. Only on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Renault is forecasting roughly stable returns this year as the French manufacturer continues an overhaul of its lineup to counter muted demand for electric vehicles in Europe. Now, for more on all of this, let's bring in Craig Trudell, who leads our global cars coverage. So, Craig, thanks so much for joining us. Look, Renault, I mean, it's not doing too badly. What's their success story looking like?
I mean, it is kind of remarkable that, these are apple and oranges figures, but Renault's, profit margins this year, look like they may be sort of in line with Mercedes, and that is just not something we would have seen or anyone would have predicted a few years back. I think it's a company that has kind of flown under the radar, the extent to which they've, sort of quietly, put together a tangible recovery as everyone around them has been really struggling with that electric transition that you mentioned, whether you want to talk about the Germans or Stellantis, which, parted ways with Carlos Tavares last year. So it has been this turnaround story that hasn't got a lot of attention because of just how troubled its peers are in this region.
Craig, overall, so Europe is trying to figure out ways to, I guess, temper some of the tariffs that the U.S. will put on Europe. I mean, there's talk about them basically, getting rid of some of the duties that they're putting on the U.S. Does it benefit the U.S. cars makers?
I think that's a real question here, and there's maybe some opportunity here just based off of some of the headlines just last night that Brussels would be willing to bring down its auto tariffs for the U.S. As a headline, that might be a win for Trump, and maybe that's enough for him. But in terms of for U.S. auto workers, there's a real mismatch between what they build in the U.S. and what European consumers want to buy. Also, GM doesn't really exist here in Europe anymore, so. How much is this really actually going to benefit U.S. workers? I think there's some real questions about just how meaningful even a headline win here would be for the U.S.
Yeah, and I guess that's the question, right? We don't know whether he wants a headline win or he actually wants to support the U.S. economy. Craig, as always, thank you so much. Craig Trudell there, who leads our global cars coverage. Now, another reminder, we'll be speaking to the U.S. Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. That's at midday London time, and that's with surveillance. Up next, Bloomberg Brief, Danny Berger in New York, and this is Bloomberg.